This is Woke Wars, a podcast by the Miami Herald's opinion team, where we look behind Florida's culture wars.
Hi, I'm Amy Driscoll, recording from the WLRN studios in downtown Miami. I'm joined by my colleagues Luisa Yanez and Isadora Rangel from the Miami Herald editorial board. Florida is all about being free these days, at least if you ask Governor Ron DeSantis. He wrote a book he called The Courage to be Free. He's called the state a citadel of freedom. His budget is called a framework of freedom. His inauguration speech used the word freedom 12 times, and the speech wasn't even all that long. At the same time, he's cracking down on free speech. He's dramatically reducing abortion rights. He's curtailing what can be taught in schools and where protests can be held and which records are public. He and the legislature are going after drag queens and transgender people, but all the time our governor is talking about freedom. Let's listen to a bit of that inauguration speech.
From the Space Coast to the Sun Coast, from St. John's to St. Lucie, from the streets of Hialeah to the Speedway in Daytona, from the Okeechobee all the way up to Micanopy, freedom lives here in our great sunshine state of Florida. Florida has led the way in preserving what the father of our country called the sacred fire of liberty. It is the fire that burned in Independence Hall when 56 men pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to establish a new nation conceived in liberty. It's the fire that burned at a cemetery in Gettysburg when the nation's first Republican president pledged to this nation a new birth of freedom. It's the fire that burned among the boys who stormed the beaches of Normandy to liberate a continent and to preserve freedom for the world. It's the fire that infused the young preacher's dream, relayed at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, that the Declaration of Independence said what it meant and meant what it said. All men are created equal.
Now, all of this is set against the backdrop of a possible presidential run by DeSantis, which you can probably tell by listening to those ringing tones. But he has run into some headwinds recently. He has a supermajority in the legislature, though, so he's been getting bill after bill passed, which gives him a lot to talk about on the campaign trail. And one of those things will no doubt be the fight that he's been having with Disney. It all began when the company spoke out against his Don't Say Gay bill, banning classroom discussion of LGBTQ issues. Isadora, what happened to Disney's freedom of speech in that case?
Yeah, so DeSantis' philosophy or attitude in governing has been pretty much, you're either with us or you're against us. And if you're not with us, we're going to get rid of you. I always thought that freedom, and what I think makes this country so great, is that you protect the freedoms of the people you disagree with. And unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing from Florida's government. Essentially, what got Disney in so much trouble, what they exercised their freedom of speech. They came out against a piece of legislation, which is something that organizations, companies, lobbyists, civic groups do every day during the legislative session. However, they were punished for going against a piece of legislation that the governor and the Republican-led legislation supported. And now they're paying for it. And not only has Disney paid for it, DeSantis is now doubling down, right? He's gone more and more extreme in terms of trying to punish Disney for essentially opposing legislation that, a lot of people had issues with. And that's where I have an issue with. Who is free in the state of Florida? Is it all of us who might agree or disagree with each other? Or is it the people who fall under some a certain ideological umbrella? And, I think people have to wonder that if they're going to complain about California or other liberal states cracking down on something, you have to be consistent. And that's my issue.
Yeah. And Luisa, you have some personal experience with repression from Cuba, right? I mean, how does that color how you look at what's happening in the state of Florida?
Yes, as somebody who grew up for a couple of years in communist Cuba, this is all, it's a selling of freedom as repression. It's a real funny twist where, everything is flipped. But some of the things that DeSantis says are very autocratic, very Castro-like, banning of books, I guess not allowing teachers to freely teach in schools, just follow a government mandate, targeting gays or transgender people, creating an other that we can all hate. It's very, very reminiscent of Cuba or Nicaragua or El Salvador. Anybody who lives in South Florida and has experienced that some of the things that DeSantis says will give them pause.
And you would think that would resonate with some people in South Florida, but so far we're seeing really little evidence of that. They supported his reelection for sure. It was a landslide, right?
That's true. Trump and DeSantis both have great support in the Latin community in Miami. It's one of those tricky things about Latin politics.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain.
Yeah, and Disney, getting back to Disney for a second, Disney had a special deal, right? They had a special deal, so they were vulnerable on that point, and so the governor went after that. But in the end, it really is about free speech, and as much as many people, including this editorial board, weren't so thrilled with the special deal that Disney got, the idea of cracking down on free speech, that should be anathema to a democracy, right?
Yeah, and I just listening to the governor's latest news conference about Disney, he and all of his allies were talking about ending corporate welfare and ending special privileges for corporations, something that you often hear from the left. The question is, again, I go back to there's so many corporations that get special privileges. Disney was one of them. Disney was basically able to govern itself through the Reedy Creek district. And I think a lot of people of all political sides can say that there was some problems with that. But what about FP&L? FP&L has an oversized influence over the legislature. How about the gun lobby? All of these groups exert insurance. But we're going after Disney not because of merits. We're going after them because the governor's trying to pick a fight with a group. And I think a lot of it is, we live in this day and age where you have to keep yourself in the news cycle as a politician. And I think DeSantis has been very good at it, but I think it could backfire. Even his fight with Disney, already some Republicans are criticizing him, saying, we are the party of business. So how far can you go?
Yeah, and even there are other positions that he's taken that Republicans are finding to be too extreme at this point. And those are those headwinds I was mentioning. Like, that's the thing that's going on right now as he continues to possibly announce, still hasn't happened, legislature is still going, and supposedly he's going to be doing it after the legislature is over. But of course, Disney's not the only thing by a long shot. One of the major flashpoints in the fight over freedom has been schools, right? And so let's listen for a second to a parent with the conservative group Moms for Liberty and speaking at a Miami-Dade County School Board meeting.
I want to make one simple statement. It's extremely simple that this is understood. No one is asking for children not to learn about sexual education and about their development. No one is asking for the children not to be taught personal hygiene. No one is asking that the children not learn the difference between male and female genders. 11-year-olds do not need to learn about abortion. Children do not need to learn that there are 9 genders. It is about inappropriate content, some inappropriate content in the books that the children do not need to be exposed to. It's just wrong.
Now, the original Parental Rights in Education Act, that's the official name of the Don't Say Gay bill, had language in it that mentioned age appropriateness. But then even that bit of discretion has been swept away because there's a new rule from the Department of Education that imposes that ban on teaching kids about sexual orientation or gender identity through the 12th grade. So that's a complete ban all the way through the end of high school. And let's remember, schools already had ways to evaluate textbooks, and they had lessons plans that they evaluated for age appropriateness. This is the state big-footing local school board control.
Yeah, and creating hysteria, right? You're creating an issue. Essentially, the narrative goes, schools are free for all. Any educator can just walk in and teach whatever they want. There are standards. There were standards, for example, for teaching sexual education. For example, abstinence, I believe, has been a requirement. and it has been for, I believe, a really long time. But now you create a fear that children are being exposed to subversive material in schools. Is that really the case? Because I agree with the parent who just spoke that the material should be age appropriate, and that children, nobody's saying let's not teach them sex ed, but is that really the case when you see schools preemptively taking books off the shelves because they're afraid of violating the law?
Right.
You have the district in Martin County, which is just north of Palm Beach County, banning certain books, anything from James Patterson to Toni Morrison. Is that really what the intent of these laws is, or are they just misinterpreting it? I don't know, but I think the vagueness is the issue here. Like, maybe the intent is that people are afraid to speak in the classroom, that they are afraid that whatever slips out could be misconstrued as indoctrination.
And that's the insidious part of repression, right? I mean, Louisa,
Exactly.
we've talked about this too. That when you think you might be in violation, you just start pulling back from all kinds of behaviors, from discussions, from freedoms. And then you end up self-censoring, and that's what repressive governments want.
Exactly. And the book banning, I mean, every teacher in Florida must feel a certain amount of fear as to what they say in the classroom now, where before, that wasn't the case. And DeSantis has done this very smartly. He knows that school boards are the place to control school districts. So he has made it his mission to appoint or get elected people who are who agree with him, who are part of who agree with what he's doing. And it's in Dade County. It's been effective. It's in Broward. They also removed the school superintendent. It's chilling what he's doing. And the idea, like Amy said, is to everybody will think twice before they say something that might anger the DeSantis world.
Yeah, and one of the great things about this country is how our government system is founded on the principle that the government that's closest to the people is best, right? And usually when you see people trust their local government way more than they trust their state, or even, let's talk about federal government. People don't trust federal government at all. These decisions about parental rights, in my view, should be made at the school level, starting with your school and then going to your district if necessary. We elect people to the school board to make decisions about curriculum, and we understand there have always been state standards because you want teaching to be consistent throughout the state. But when you talk about this fight for parental rights, like we've heard from parents that some of their issues involving parental rights are very basic, like I cannot get in touch with a teacher. The teacher is not responding, but then you have the state come in and essentially dictate how those interactions are going to be between a teacher and a student. I have an issue. Second issue I have with it is academia. Our state universities, you look at UF, which is it's a top 5 school in the nation. And now there's a bill in the legislature that won't allow professors to discuss certain theories that say, for example, that there's systemic racism in this country, and that's inherent. That's a trait of American society. Now, you can't have those conversations in the places where you're supposed to have these conversations. So where else are young people going to be learning things that perhaps the state doesn't like, but are important to be discussed?
And are theories. They aren't necessarily facts. They're theories, but if you go to college, you're supposed to be exposed to ideas that you've not been exposed to before. You're trying to educate your mind, not just follow some, specific path. And I think that that's being lost in all of this.
And New College has become a petri dish of this kind of thinking from DeSantis. It's funny. He picked the one college that's really widely known as being very liberal, sort of loosey-goosey, and he has sent people in there to change it. Now, that's all he has to do. Everybody else, every other university in the state will see what happens at New College and will refrain from following anything that New College was doing. And that's how you do it. You make somebody an example, and I think that's what he's doing with Disney. You make somebody an example, and it has a ripple effect that's very effective.
And are we going to attract the best and the brightest? in academia to Florida. I mean, we have heard anecdotally, and we don't have any data on this yet, but you hear oftentimes professors say professors don't want to be hired and move to Florida because they're afraid of essentially it's your life's work. You get a master's degree, you get a PhD in something, and you want to feel free to speak about this issue that you have expertise on. And I think it's very troubling. And academics are always the target of autocratic systems, right?
Always.
They're always subversive. They are indoctrinating. And I mean, just read the writing on the wall. Look at the rhetoric and just look at history. And, it's just very clear. And I believe that this country has strong institutions. I don't think we would ever descend into an authoritative regime. I'm not saying that. But any freedom that gets taken away, I think it's bad, especially when you're talking about, freedom of speech in a setting that it's supposed to be where you're supposed to feel free to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a flashpoint in the past, and here it is again, and yet we don't seem to learn from those things. And then there's the fight over public records, which I find particularly interesting. You were talking, Isadora, about government closest to the people being the most effective. That's the idea of many parts of democracy. But when you start to shield the public's right to see public records, then how are you supposed to know what your government is doing in your name with your money, and they only exist because you allow them to? That to me, I don't understand people's embrace of the idea that government probably knows best. They're shielding that from us for a reason. Like, well, no, they should not. Often the reason is because there is corruption, or because there is misspending of money, or because there's favoritism or cronyism. Those are the reasons that we should know how our money is being spent. And, the latest thing, of course, is that DeSantis wants to not have to reveal where he's going, who he's meeting with, how he's spending his time, potentially how he's spending our money. It's unclear. Normally, under the current law, we the people would have to be reimbursed if he spent money on trips and things that were for personal reasons. And I think that is one more example of how, our freedoms are being, chipped away at.
Yeah. And almost, I feel like every legislative session, there is an exemption passed for, a public records exemption that's passed. Last year, they shielded the information of people who are vying to become university presidents. We won't know who the candidates for a university president position are until later in the selection process. And then right after they passed that bill, they hired the new UF president, who happens to be a Republican politician, Ben Sasse from Nebraska. I struggle not putting those two things together. And maybe it was just a coincidence. I don't know. I don't have any particular information about that. But it is troubling when we see how the DeSantis administration has slow-walked. They have stonewalled several public records requests, even with the Miami Herald, So at what point can we justify that as being for the sake of the people or for safety and security?
Right. And we used to be known as the Sunshine State for our public records laws. And that may be changing now.
Yeah, he would like to change that. And we should, putting all these things together, and we should make note that we've never had a governor like this. This is really a very hands-on to local government, into our daily life, into schools, into his also what's notable is his dislike of the media. He doesn't feel he has to answer to anybody. He can be kind of a scary politician.
Yeah. Let's take a little break here. We'll be right back. We're back with Woke Wars. We're discussing whether or not Florida really is the freest state. DeSantis has been talking a lot about freedom in Florida, but he's not the only person. In fact, President Biden just announced he's running for re-election. And in his announcement, he said something that's particularly on point. He said, "The question we are facing is whether in the years ahead we have more freedom or less freedom, more rights or fewer." And I thought that was pretty striking because, it's not just a question here in Florida. And we know that from some of these issues, including transgender stuff, right? I mean, that's the crackdown on that has been...
Yeah, and also
not just here.
Yeah, but also we have to understand why DeSantis appeals to a lot of people too. I think that he does have a valid claim sometimes that he has protected quote unquote freedoms. Like during COVID, for example, he shut down the state, but then reopened the state a lot sooner than other states. He forced schools to reopen, for example. I think those, looking from a political lens, were very successful moves on his part.
Agreed.
And I remember sitting on a boat in the Keys. It was towards the tail end of the pandemic. There were two people from New York sitting next to me, and they started talking about how bad the shutdowns were, that they were locked in their apartments in New York, and people down here were basically enjoying the sun and being out and about. I think a lot of people in Florida might maybe take for granted those freedoms. And I think now that the pandemic is in the rearview mirror for most Americans, I think the narrative changes, right? Like, we made it, we survived. Obviously, over 1 million people didn't. But I think politically he can make that claim because people suffered because of these shutdowns. There's no doubt about it. Children suffered, businesses, workers suffered. And I think he can make that claim very easily. Do I think it's going to work in 2024 necessarily, with the pandemic being so far behind us? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But I think that attracts people to him.
And we should note that COVID is what makes DeSantis.
Yeah.
The DeSantis we know today, he was not this governor right after he was elected the first time. He evolves as COVID evolves. And it's like a light goes off in the top of his head, and he found a new path as a politician through COVID.
Yeah, and I think, we do know that Florida has record in migration, right? So people are attracted to the state. Now, whether they're attracted because of DeSantis or because we don't have an income tax or, because of the sunshine, we don't know, but he certainly claims it as a win for him. And I think we can't discount that. I think we have to say, yeah, I think there's a lot that is attractive to people about that general idea. I think where it breaks down is when you start, cracking down on all these other things. It's not just... so he had a winning strategy when it came to COVID, unless of course you count all the people who died.
Yeah.
But then when you take that beyond, the crisis, then there's all these other things.
Yeah. And then let's look at how he's demonizing the LGBTQ community, which is like, living in South Florida, the gay community is so active and so vibrant. You have Wilton Manors, you have LGBTQ parades. And to me, it's very disheartening to see how he has demonized these people. When the governor of Florida is coming after transgender youth, I was just listening to a report by one of our local radio NPR affiliates, talking to a kid who is transgender, and her family decided that she would go finish high school in the Northeast because she didn't feel safe here and she couldn't get her treatment. So is that freedom when you have to ship your kid to another state? Some people might not believe that transgender people exist or have the right to, but is it their right to impose that view on the rest of us?
Right. I mean, I think there's that's we talked about before with the parental rights. Whose rights are not being, some rights are getting, a boost, and other rights are being completely discounted. So yeah, and that's what's been going on here. I think there's also the defamation bill to talk about too, which was, it's so far been bogged down in the legislature. We're not sure if it's going to go forward. It seems like maybe not, but that was also an attempt to, chill the press, right?
Yeah, and it faced incredible backlash from conservative media outlets. Why? Because it affects everybody. When you pass a law, it affects both liberal and conservatives, right? So, and the Fox News settlement with Dominion, I think, really shows that the law, the way that it is, it's working, right? Because Fox News was being held accountable because of its role in the 2020 elections. And then lowering that bar, can you imagine? If I were a liberal lawyer, I would be listening to conservative talk radio, just waiting to file a lawsuit, because now it's like you really got to muzzle yourself.
Right.
And this is not, I think, what this country is about. When people are afraid of what they said, they might actually, the government or they might get sued for their words,
Right. And to me, all of this is still nothing but a distraction, really, because most of these things are not things that reach lots of people. In the meantime, we're not handling our insurance crisis, which is getting worse and worse. We have unaffordable housing in this state. There's so many big issues here that are just being shoved to the back of the pile because we're attacking all these other things. And I think we are at the end of our time now. So I'm going to have to let myself have the last word there. We would like to thank WLRN Studios. Our engineer was Peter Meritz. Our videographer was Jose Iglesias. And special thanks to George Fishman for audio editing. You'll find more episodes of Woke Wars at miamiherald.com/Woke Wars. Also consider subscribing to The Herald at miamiherald.com/subscribe. See you next time.